Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Ms. Lee, page 143, line 5, insert federal after the.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I rise in strong opposition to the rider included in this bill that challenges the District of Columbia's right to home rule. So my amendment, one which I've offered in the past, is simple. By inserting the word federal in Section 810, it would allow locally elected officials in the District of Columbia to control the city's own funds and decide whether or not to make those funds available for the reproductive health care services it deems as best for its residents. It's really shameful that once again, low-income women in the district have become a target of this bill. Here we go again. Another battle in this war against women. This harmful policy rider is a clear violation of the District of Columbia's home rule. It marginalizes the city and its residents, and it blatantly impedes upon the ability of the district to self-govern. No other jurisdiction or state is told how to use its locally raised revenue. So why should we force Congress's view on the District of Columbia, or some members of Congress's view on the District of Columbia? To be clear, removal of the D.C. abortion ban would not alter the current prohibition against federal funding of abortion services. The Hyde Amendment currently forbids federal funding for low-income women on Medicaid. Despite my personal view that the Hyde Amendment should be overturned, that provision would remain unchanged. My amendment deals only with the unfair anti-home rule restriction to the district's ability to use its own revenues the way it so chooses. It's past time that Congress stop playing politics with D.C.'s home rule. The District of Columbia should be free to use its locally raised tax revenue in the way it deems best. Last weekend, the United States Conference of Mayors passed a resolution supporting women's reproductive rights and blasted extreme efforts to hinder access to health care. As mayors across this country work to provide services to residents with extremely tight budgets, I applaud their actions to pursue ways to improve women's safe and accessible access to comprehensive reproductive health care. Now, in the district, mind you, 81% of non-elderly Medicaid recipients are black, and 13% are Hispanic. Additionally, 53% of residents receiving assistance are women. This means that of the Washingtonians whose access to abortion care would be restricted by local funding funds in this bill, the vast majority, 94%, are women of color. What are we doing? Just what are we doing? We're doing this against the request of the district, against the request of mayors across the country, and we're targeting women of color in only one city in our country. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I don't want any of my colleagues telling my district, my cities, Oakland, the largest city in my district, how to spend its locally raised revenues. Likewise, I'm sure that all of you, none of you, would want the same local, you want the same local autonomy for your cities in your district, and you would not want this restriction. Now, what D.C. does have is a brilliant and tireless representative in Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who continues to fight on their behalf, even as many continue to fight to deny her a vote. And so we have to be able to allow her and the District of Columbia to enact their local rules and spend their local tax dollars like every other jurisdiction in America. The district's residents should be treated as fairly as we expect any other citizens to be treated. The federal government should not restrict the rights of D.C. residents to determine how their local tax dollars are spent, and allow the district's government to decide how best to assist its residents. This is an issue of home rule. None of you would want this happening in your own districts. So I urge you to support my amendment.
Ms. Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me say to my friend from California that this certainly isn't a war on women, and certainly not on women of color either. Just to give everybody a little bit of background, between fiscal year 1990 6 in fiscal year 2009 appropriations bills for the District of Columbia prohibited taxpayer-funded abortions, and many of those bills were drafted by the Democratic Party and signed by Democratic presidents. Then in fiscal year 2010, the Financial Services Bill lifted this restriction to allow local funds for abortion. However, the restriction was reinstated in fiscal year 2011 year-long CR and fiscal year 2012, and this is the only local restriction in the bill. And as you all know, we do need to move forward on this. As I've said, as I just mentioned, when Chairman Serrano was chair, he modified the restriction to only prohibit federal funds for abortion in the fiscal year 2011 bill. But on the House floor, that language was considered legislative and couldn't be modified to prevent local funds for abortion. And so I don't know if any of y'all remember, but the issue almost took down the rule for consideration in the fiscal year 2010 Financial Services Bill. And the Speaker Pelosi, had to hold open the vote for nearly half an hour to get Democratic members to change their votes and allow for consideration of the bill that allows local funds for D.C. abortion. And so my point in explaining all that is to say that if we want the Financial Services Bill to move forward, and I admit there are probably people here who don't want it to move forward, and you want the D.C. government to be able to spend any of their local funds on anything else other than the abortion, then we have to include the language prohibiting funds for abortion, because the House won't pass a rule to allow consideration of the bill on the floor without it. So voting for this amendment is voting to stop the Financial Services Bill from moving through the appropriations process and stopping funds for the city and all of the federal agencies in the subcommittee's jurisdiction. So I urge a no vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say that I disagree with my counterpart. It's because there are so many D.C. writers on this bill that this bill hasn't seen the floor in a couple of years and probably won't do it again. This, to me, is such a simple issue, and it's a very personal issue to me. You see, I was born in an American territory called Puerto Rico, and while I cherish my American citizenship and try every day to be a better American, I know that 114-year relationship is and continues to be, has been and continues to be a colonial relationship where Puerto Rico is treated as a colony. So when I became chairman of this committee and now as ranking member, I made a comment that some people laughed at. I said I was going to be the first member of Congress to give up power rather than take power. I don't want to oversee the District of Columbia more than the Constitution mandates. And the Constitution doesn't mandate that we have to act like the city council or the mayor of the District of Columbia. And so what happens, with all due respect to my colleagues on the other side, and I mean this sincerely, is that there are members of Congress who feel that it is necessary to say that they're strong on certain issues. But they can't do that in their own districts or in their own states. So what they do is they take a stance on abortion in Washington, D.C. They take a stance on needle exchange programs in Washington, D.C. They're against same-sex marriage in Washington, D.C. They're for bearing arms 24/7 anywhere in the District of Columbia. Not necessarily do they vote that way back home. And so what happens is that District of Columbia has become this sort of playground for members of Congress to say, I'm strong on these issues. Really? Where? Oh, in Washington, D.C. I tell them what to do. Well, I don't want to be part of that, and neither should anyone here. We're not asking you to vote today on the issue of abortion. We're asking you to vote today on the issue of whether you think that you were elected to be a member of the City Council of the District of Columbia, or whether the American citizens who live in D.C. have the right to govern themselves. That's what this is about, and it's not just about this provision, it's about all the other ones we mentioned. So if you have respect for American citizens who live either in territories or in districts of Columbia, then you have to take a stand today and say, I'm still strong on this issue, but I'm stronger on the issue of people being able to govern themselves, and this is what it's all about. And so I support the gentleman.
Will the gentleman yield for a moment?
Sure.
let me first say that I don't know anybody who is more sincere than you, Joe. And so I have great respect and admiration for that. But just to address one point you made that isn't specific to the rider on abortion, is that you said we have lots of riders in D.C., but we don't have any other riders on any of the issues other than abortion. So I just wanted to make that clarification.
I understand, reclaiming my time. I assure you that if this bill comes to the floor, you will see amendments from your side on all the riders that I took out years ago and which you and the leadership of the committee has left aside for now. So it's an ongoing battle, and I'm maybe forewarning people to the fact that some folks want to face November knowing that they were great on these issues, but only in Washington, D.C.
There being no further discussion, Mr.
Sorry.
Ohio.
You want to just... Mr. Chairman, let me just briefly say that, first of all, I appreciate Ms. Lee's concern about protecting local governments' rights to make decisions, but I think it's important that we not confuse the funding issue and also what this amendment does. In that when we're talking about federal and local funds with D.C., because we're appropriating those funds are being commingled and put in the same pot, so to speak, and then being separated by designation or by bookkeeping process is my understanding of the process. But let me also go back to Article 1 of the United States Constitution, which says that Congress holds complete legislative authority over the District of Columbia, quote, exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever. And that's why we're responsible for that budget. And because it's appropriated by Congress through the annual appropriations bill, Congress then bears the constitutional responsibility for the use of those funds. And I think this language that's in the bill is very clear. It prohibits the use of congressionally appropriated taxpayer funds, federal or local, from being spent on abortions except when the life of a mother is endangered or in the case of rape or incest. Because the federal and the local funds, this is my understanding, are commingled, separating them is just a mere bookkeeping process or designation. And by simply designating the funds as local, they can be used to pay for abortions, and the city can continue to fund abortions on demand. So limiting the abortion funding prohibition to federal, as Ms. Lee is trying to do right now, results really in no limitations in that those funds can be designated as local. And what we've seen happen, and this was recently in the when I was Associated Press in July 7, 2011, that was during the period of time that the D.C. Hyde Amendment was removed in D.C., it paid for approximately 300 abortions. So we know the direction that this is going to go. And I think most Americans, Republicans and Democrats alike, know that and oppose the fact that using their hard-earned taxpayer dollars to fund abortions, they oppose that. And as was mentioned by the chairwoman, that this Appropriations Committee, both Republicans and Democrats, have supported the D.C. abortion funding ban in the past. So with that, I would oppose the amendment, and I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Lowy.
I thank the chair. And I just want to rise once again in strong support of this amendment. What I find absolutely amazing is that at a time when this committee is trying to balance investments in our future with fiscal austerity, and I respect that, the majority is going out of its way to prevent the district from using its own funds for safe, legal health services. The lack of public funding for health services creates an additional financial burden for already impoverished families, forcing women to choose between using out-of-pocket finances for reproductive services and paying for other necessities for their families. The Guttmacher Institute has reported that poor women are often forced to use money that would have been spent on rent, utility bills, food, and clothing for themselves to pay proper health services. This language seeks to really insult the people who are living in the District of Columbia, and our ranking member said it so eloquently. Why should we be deciding what the people in the District of Columbia are doing with their local dollars? I think my colleague made it clear that maybe they'd be better off serving in the district council if they want to control the District of Columbia. None of the people in this room were elected to force a radical, ideologically driven agenda upon the residents of the District of Columbia. I strongly support my colleague, and I thank you for this amendment.
There being no further discussion, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. D.C.'s locally elected leadership should decide what's best for the District of Columbia. And to my colleague, the Home Rule Act was passed to finally afford some semblance of democracy to American citizens who reside in D.C. If we allow this anti-home rule rider to prevail, it would only further diminish their democratic constitutional rights. Americans living in our nation's capital pay federal taxes, they serve on juries, they fight and they die in wars, but they're denied voting representation in Congress. And to the chair of this committee, let me just say, yes, this is the only rider. Women are always sacrificed. That's the point. This is another battle in this war against women. It's the only restriction. And the fact is 94% of the women are women of color, and the majority are African American women. The District of Columbia should be free to use its locally raised tax revenue in the way it deems best.
On the Lee amendment, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. No. Noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Request is for a roll call vote. A sufficient number responding. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Austria. No. Mr. Austria, no. Mr. Bishop. Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Bonner. No. Mr. Bonner, no. Mr. Calvert. No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Dix. Aye. Mr. Dix, aye. Mrs. Emerson.
No.
Mrs. Emerson, no. Mr. Farr. Aye. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah. Aye. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Flake. No. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. No. Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Hinchy. Yes. Mr. Hinchy, aye. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Jackson. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston. No. Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham. No. Mr. Latham, no. Mr. LaTourette. No. Mr. LaTourette, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mr. Lewis. Mrs. Lowy. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Mrs. Lummis. Mrs. Lummis, no. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunnally. Mr. Nunnally, no. Mr. Olver. Mr. Olver, aye. Mr. Pastor. Mr. Pastor, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Reberg. No. Mr. Reberg, no. Mr. Rogers. No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Rothman, aye. Ms. Roybal Allard. Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Schiff. Aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano. Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Mr. Wolf. No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack. No. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. No. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. No. Mr. Young, no.
Are there members who wish to record their vote or change their vote? Hearing none, clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 21, the nays are 26. The amendment is not agreed to.